taking more of a practitioner approach to today's presentation. Hopeful that maybe some of you will see ways in which things that we've been able to do at Musashi might fit within your context as well. I've worked at Musashi since 2004, both as a teacher and administrator. My primary duties have centered on the inbound short-term students who come to Musashi, and the majority of those students participate in our East Asian Studies program. Prior to my career at Musashi, I spent some time at University of Hawaii. I was in the study abroad center there. However, and of course maybe like many of you in the room as well, I would say I'm very much a product of international education. After all, you know, how does a semester abroad in Amsterdam put me in Shinjuku? That's the way it gets going. So, you know, I'm very much, you know, a believer in some of the messages and the focuses of studying abroad. And certainly as we look through, you know, some of the ways in which to approach things like personal learning and development, education, educational decisions, career choices and professional development, understanding of world issues and relationships, the idea of a worldview and exploring your values, and global engagement. You know, of course, you know, this is what we like to talk about as practitioners. You know, we like these fancy magazine covers and, you know, shouting about core values and creating opportunities and being a pathfinder and all of this kind of thing. But, you know, when we get to this point, you know, isn't this more like what our students are going through, you know, in the sense that maybe this is sort of their reality, you know, that we're just kind of throwing them together, you know, we're grouping them in programs that maybe have hundreds and sometimes thousands of students on campus in that way, and we're just having them fight over the meager morsels that we as staff, you know, limited staff, can throw at them with our limited resources as well. In addition, you know, maybe we're just telling them, oh, jump right in, you know, it's okay, but we don't ask them, can you swim? You know, do you need help? And I think that, you know, this is kind of the way in which I've sort of worked at framing how we approach our inbound orientation program. To be there, you know, not so much as to say this is the way to do it, but to, you know, be on the side, to be more of a coach, to be that person who can, you know, put the pole out or throw the lifesaver if needed in that way. You know, for me, coming from Wisconsin, you know, this was what I grew up in, and you know, being able to transition to this, you know, is quite a shock. And so it's not surprising that when students come to our university, they'll make comments such as this. So one of the exercises that I do during our orientation is I give them, about an hour or so just to do some free writing. How are you feeling right now? And these are some of the comments that come up. The idea of hysterically crying, you know, the first night, from exhaustion, being completely overwhelmed, being trapped, you know, in the city, the sheer amount of people compressed into one space. And I like the last one, the idea of Tokyo is not the land of Hello Kitty, it is the concrete mass of endless noise. And he went on for a couple of pages as to how it wasn't quite like what life in Kent in the UK was like. You know, again, first impressions. So I'd like to, you know, again give you that macro view of our orientation. And again, I'm dealing with short-term students, okay? The idea of providing some type of guidance, okay, for them while they're coming. And just as a quick, this is about the only data that I have, but I want to give you a context of where we're at with short-term students in Japan. And so on the JASTO site, it talks about this idea of a short-term student being 1 year or less, okay? And if we look just very briefly, quickly at the students by nationality, obviously China, the US, Republic of Korea, Taiwan, France, Germany, UK, Australia. We get students from those destinations, that's why I highlighted those. But little over, almost close to 13,000 students. As far as regions go, we do know that 62% of the students are coming from Asia, and then 30+%, 32% coming from Europe and North America. And you know, that kind of gives me a reason to pause as well when I go through these orientations, and knowing what I know, how particularly the US higher education sort of drives a number of issues within that, whether it's through NAFSA, which the conference just finished last week with close to 10,000 people coming into Boston. So does it become sort of this another form of imperialism? Are we putting our own values on it? Is it really of benefit to go through an orientation as I'm going to present to you? You can maybe decide afterwards and give me a thumbs up or thumbs down, that kind of thing. Just a little further context to make some sense of the data. I requested the raw data from JASO. They're happy to send it. And so what I was able to do is sort of crunch the numbers, so to speak, and we know that there are 781 universities in Japan. 636 have at least one international student on campus, either as degree-seeking or short-term student. So that's 81% of all universities in Japan. Of those 636, 385 have short-term students. Okay, so that's 61% of the international universities that we have here in Japan. As we look at that, 46% of the short-term international students, close to 5,800, are enrolled in programs with at least 100 students. Okay, so that's these numbers right here. This, by the way, any guesses as to 700 plus, what university that is? Audience participation. Waseda. 700. They actually, the previous year, they only had 500 and some, and they went up to 700 in 1 year. Okay. We won't make a valid judgment on that today. We'll do it on another panel. But anyway, and so that's 28%, 28 universities representing only 9% of the total universities that have short-term programs. We go down to the bottom and we look at those programs that are under 20 students, so down here, right, you can see that 13% of the total number of students, or 1,600 students, okay, are enrolled in 64% of the universities, okay? So 246 universities down here having programs under 20, okay? And as we can see, the average size of a short-term program is 33 students, with the median being about 11 students, okay? So that's where we're at as an overall picture of the type of students that I'm mainly dealing with. Musashi has a few degree-seeking students that come in, but the majority of our students, 28 to 30 each year, each term, are on these short-term programs. Okay. So that's been my focus in that way. This idea of thinking of conceptualizing of an orientation. Is it something that, as a compass, you're out there to guide? Is it an induction? Breaking in, it's an idea of adjustment, okay? Acclimation, assimilation, familiarization. The idea too of putting it together with the mortar or the glue. I really have come to understand our orientation, at least at Musashi, as a way to hold together the program. Because you do have students obviously coming for their academic components, but they're their social components as well. They might be off working on a job, and so you've got these little bricks, as it were, here and there. What can the orientation do to sort of help them make sense of all that and guide them through and place that together? And so that's where I see an orientation fitting. It's not being a separate brick, but being that mortar or that glue that's going to hold your program together and give it some identity. Another consideration that we think about is how long is an orientation, right? Is it from touchdown to textbooks or landing to learning, that kind of thing, real short, intensive? Or are you able to space it out? Are you able to continue it? Maybe not even every month, but at a regular interval. Maybe 1 or 2 additional meetings. Maybe having a pre-departure. Maybe reaching out prior to coming to Japan and doing some sort of online and getting a sense of where your students are, who your students are. You see the applications, but it doesn't really give you an idea of who they are. Why are they coming to Japan? Right? Why are they coming to Japan? In terms of how we've focused, obviously you've got to go through the procedures and the policies and take them around campus and show them where this and that are. But as I've evolved in looking at how an orientation should be run, some of the key components that we don't see too often covered in Japan. And I'm basing that on my experience as running a best practices orientation workshop through JAFSA. Quick plug, the 7th of which will be on July 3rd. But anyway, you're free to send your staff over and participate. We go through, in terms of dealing with uncertainties, How do you mobilize your students? Connecting with peers, establishing those personal networks. The idea of facilitating intercultural communication, initiating that understanding, the small steps that we can take at that time to work on intercultural competence, and then certainly promoting all aspects of healthy lifestyle. And that's not only the physical, but also the mental as well. And that's one of the issues that I bring up within the first couple of days of my orientation. That, look, many of you are coming with things that we can't see, right? And one of the things I do is I'll stand in front of them and say, how much does this weigh? And they're like, well, 25 ounces or whatever. And I said, well, okay, how about if I hold this for an hour? How about if I hold this for a day, a week, a month, 10 years? That's mental health right here, right? So the idea of it doesn't have to be such a big object, but the longer you hold that in, and coming to Japan may trigger something, may exacerbate a condition, and I've seen that happen. Maybe some of you have as well. So we need to get that out right away. And fortunately for those of us who work in Tokyo, there are some great support networks. My campus is quite small, so we can't have a native English speaker or Korean speaker, French speaker, German speaker on campus, but there are counseling services here in Tokyo that you can tie into, and we've done that. It works very well to provide additional support for our students. And that said, I'm trying to basically understand how students are seeing Japan. What is their motivation to study abroad? And as I plan orientations, I'm then able to look at and see how can we address the issues. And of course, we focus on the 80% of desire to travel, expand my worldview. But what I'm really interested in, actually, and how I've sort of come up with the philosophy, are those individuals down here. The idea need to be different. The desire to get away from life in my own country, desire to get away from my home institution, desire to get away from someone or something else. Those are kind of triggers that something has happened back home, okay? And they may be trying to come here and get away from that, make a clean start, okay? Or hoping that that experience will stop the drift in uncertainty, okay? So that gives me a better sense when I have a student body coming in, as to how we can approach and address issues as we move through our orientation. So what I've tried to do is to set up this, real basic matrix. A lot of C's, works well that way, I guess. But the idea to create, okay, to create a sense of calm, okay, amongst the students. And again, this is in the initial few days, okay. Give them a sense of comfort. How are they going to fit in, okay? Making connections right away, not just with the Japanese students, which many are eager to do, but also with the other international students. And that's really an valuable connection that they can make. Like I said, we've got students coming from Germany and France and the UK, Taiwan, Korea, China, and to see how they continue those personal networks, not only with Japanese students, but others outside, it's very rewarding to see that. Obviously, communication is very important, the idea of setting up a community. And again, some evidence as to why we want to do it this way. Again, this was a different student who was in the free writing a few years ago now, but the idea of not being too happy, okay, when the student arrived. It's not like they're being sad or depressed, but it feels normal in some way, but there's this feel of nothingness that this student was experiencing. And didn't think it was linked to Japan. It turned out it wasn't. This particular student, within that 6-month, 9-month period, had an acquaintance and a friend commit suicide. And so coming to Japan and having set up in that way. And so again, making that person feel comfortable, establishing that trust, very important. A couple other strategies that I've sort of looked at, and the idea of making sure that we are able to evolve the presentation or the orientation. I do sense that students are a little different than they were 10 years ago when I'm coming. They seem to be more active, at least the ones that we're getting at Musashi. The idea of trying to anticipate, okay, to encourage participation as well. So being very future-oriented. I don't know if it's because I'm not really satisfied with what's going on, but at the same time, I do sense that there is a need to evolve and change, and I think the students that we've had coming have appreciated that as we've gone through our program. And again, this idea of how to address needs of students. This was a student from a few years ago, as is described, being ethnically Chinese but culturally Western, and the idea of not fitting in, identity issues, are very come to the fore when a student comes to Japan and placed in this type of setting. So for me, again, the idea of just focusing on that one student, it's kind of the same thing when I'm teaching classes as well. If I get one kid who has the shiny eyes who are focused on me throughout the lecture, I'm happy to see that. And the same thing, with the orientation. Of course, I'd like to see more than just one, but if I get one, I really feel it's been worthwhile to go through that. And it's the idea of when we're going through, listening, not just hearing what they're saying, looking at them, not just seeing through them, and really speaking to them, not just talking at them in that way. So the big question, right, at the end of the day, and this was the most intimidating question I got as a graduate student. I don't know, some of you may have heard me tell this before. I like this line, this little story of a professor that I had. And I didn't have that person on my committee, probably, thankfully, but a great individual at the University of Hawaii, and you sit down and you're sharing everything that you've done over the last 6 months of your research, and wow, I found this, I found that, I found that. And the professor sits back very calmly, and then the first question out of the mouth is, so what? And you're like, well, but so this is sort of the way in which I'm also trying to approach and understand, again, this idea of, so what? Again, is this just an American, being driven by, a sort of American-centric kind of industry at this point, okay, putting my values in where perhaps they're not needed so much, or maybe even not appreciated. So that's the challenge for me I'm going through. But I hope that for the students, that this idea of that they are being able to initiate connections to others, as well as facilitate understanding of their own experience. That the second point being that they're investigating not only the place where they're at, but the whys and hows of how they got here and why they're here. The idea of discovering sort of the short term, the immediate, the medium term, the aha moments, and the long-term legacy moments created on that international education experience. So for me, when I do the orientation at the end of each day, I give them a chance for feedback, okay, immediate feedback. The aha moments come a couple of months later, especially after we've talked about culture shock, and they'll say to me, didn't understand why you were telling me the second day in Japan about culture shock. I got it now. So that's the aha moment. And as far as the legacy goes, I don't know if others have had such a rewarding experience as I've had, but when you get that email from the student that says, I'm applying to graduate school, will you please write me a letter of recommendation? Students coming back to our campus on a regular basis. They're in Japan, they stop by Musashi to say hello. The idea of staying in touch through Facebook. Those are, again, sort of the longer term. They bought into the program. We've established a good identity for them, and they have a real affinity for the program. And the idea, too, of finally engaging, in those transnational skills, the idea of the global perspective, the local responsiveness, synergizing learning, transition and adaptation, the idea of cross-cultural integration and collaboration through that foreign experience are all things, again, that we're telling students that's what employers want to see, and hopefully that's what they're engaging in that way. As far as the institution goes, I do feel that, again, this is one way to further internationalize the campus and develop that campus ethos in that way, because many institutions are still quite, I don't know if inward looking is not, I don't know if that's the right term, but just not willing to probably step outside the gate quite yet, open the gate so widely. It certainly is a way to professionalize international education staff and also understand how that knowledge and experience is accumulated. I think we're all familiar with the rotation system in Japan, and for better or for worse, I can see the value on both sides, but I think in international education, the idea of especially someone who's gathered the knowledge, has the experience, gone to international conferences, and then after 5 years is rotated into accounting, that might not be the best way to, again, facilitate the cultivation of that individual's knowledge and expertise and share it with others. Okay? It's also a way to look at that portfolio that the institution likes to show on the website. Okay, in particular, and one of the things that I've found again in that workshop that I've done is that not a lot of collaboration goes on with partner institutions, and I think an orientation would be a real good opportunity to work with a key partner institution to develop some type of learning tool, whether it is an institution in China or in Australia or Korea, Taiwan, France. Bridging and working with partner institutions on developing the orientation is one way forward. And then I think also too the idea of facilitating global engagement, contributing to the cultivation of the global citizens. Showing that you do care about the visitors. Not just. And this is the hard part with, I think, short-term students. I think they sometimes become the most neglected students on campus, right? Because the home institution is like, okay, see ya. All right, we get them, we're so happy to see them, okay, but we know they're gonna leave, so we don't have to put a lot of time in it, so it's, goodbye. And so, this idea of, really standing up and investing in them and saying, no, you're part of our campus culture, we're happy you're here, and we're going to do right by you while you're here on our campus. As far as the practitioner goes, this idea of being able to connect and to guide with students to facilitate their understanding, to maintain my youthful appearance, I think that's another thing as well. A chance to broaden and redefine the educational experience, in terms of orientations really being learning opportunities. It's not, again, always about the academicness of being in the classroom. The orientation can also facilitate that as well. And then it's an opportunity also to establish that credibility and express our passion as an international educator. And I think that professionalization is also something that's not quite where I would hope it would be after working in Japan for 10 years. There's so many of my colleagues that they've got master's degrees, but they're on 3 or 5 year contracts. So they don't know what to do, where they're going to be in a couple of years. And so this idea, I think that is also a fundamental change that really needs to work its way into the ethos of international education throughout Japan. And whether it is that massive program of 700 students or that short-term program that only has 4 or 5 students, the idea of developing a healthier ecosystem, international education ecosystem, is something that I think through the orientation practices, through sharing of that, can be done. And I hope to see that. As finally, a couple more points I'd like to raise: the idea of orientations as opportunities to focus on the quality. Again, I've talked about engagement and mentoring students, to be creative, to connect and collaborate within Japan. We don't see a lot of intra-Japan collaboration as well. And I know that, for example, my university has a number of different networks that we could work together on and do joint orientations, or at least joint retreats, or a mental health day, for example. These are the types of ideas that we need to share amongst each other, pool our resources, come together for the benefit of not only the short-term students. I don't mean to focus always on them, because I think a lot can be applied to those degree-seeking students as well, and graduate students that are here for a short term, but more collaboration within our universities here in Japan. I also think, finally, that last point of building the brand recognition that Japan can be a worthwhile and valued education abroad destination. It's quite competitive. We're always wringing our hands as to why students don't come to Japan, why don't Japanese students leave? Well, what are we really doing to facilitate, to brand ourselves in a better way as well? So, in conclusion, how do I measure success? That's, again, another so what. This was just 2 days ago. 2 guys showed up on the campus. Okay, they studied here a couple of years ago, but here they are, smiling, happy to be walking around campus again, trying to find their friends, trying to find the professors that they have courses with. And one final reflection that was written by a student again, the idea that's not just about Japan. It's about myself. It's about learning to cope with new situations, new thoughts, and people. It's about standing by oneself, growing and learning. It's about viewing things from new angles. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Brian, very much. As mentioned earlier, we'll wait till after both presenters ask questions. Our next presenter is Regan Tyndall from Asia University.